lots of folks here with us today. Good morning if you're in Calgary, where we are speaking to you from, and hope you're having a good day if you're elsewhere across Canada, across North America, and we have a few people from Europe as well. So welcome to all of these folks who've joined us here today. This set of conversations that we're starting off with, the first one today, is a collaborative offering between the Cooksayer Center for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning at Mount Royal University in Calgary and the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning at the University of Calgary. My name is Heather Demnitsky, and I'm the academic lead for teaching and learning research at the Taylor Institute. And it's my pleasure to collaborate with my colleagues at MRU to put this on. So just to start with a land acknowledgement, at the University of Calgary, we acknowledge that we're located on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki, the Bearspaw, and the Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And myself, I'm a native Calgarian. I'm a settler here in Calgary, and I'm an outdoor enthusiast and also a field biologist by training. And so for myself, I really like to acknowledge that I live, I work, I learn, and I play on these lands. And I'm grateful for that privilege. This picture here is from the Mount Assiniboine area from a hiking trip, climbing trip I was on a few years ago. And that's a really special part of Alberta and the border with BC. If you've ever had a chance to get there, it's a really beautiful part of the world. And so I'm really grateful to be someone who spends a lot of their time on these lands around us. So for those who've joined us again in the last few minutes here, this is the Brave Conversations in SoTL Speaker Series collaboration between MRU and the University of Calgary. And we're really excited to offer you an international slate of scholars. The work that we're going to talk about over the course of this series of talks centers around critical approaches to themes of epistemic justice, students as knowers, and threshold experiences in higher ed. So really pertinent topics to the ways that we are all trying to think and move in higher ed and post-secondary education. And so without any more from me, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Michelle Yeo, who is the director of the Cooksayer Center at MRU, and she will introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you so much, Heather. Really appreciate that. Yeah, I'm a settler scholar here as well on Treaty 7 territory, and I really appreciated your words of acknowledgement, Heather, and would like to acknowledge the same. I'm just delighted to be part of this series. It's been a while in the making. We've been talking about a series like this throughout the pandemic, and so we're just really excited to actually be in the virtual room with all of you and starting the conversation. I'm just delighted to introduce my dear colleague, Cherie Woolmer, who I work with in the Cooksayer Center at Mount Royal University, where she's an assistant professor and the Canada Research Chair in Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. Dr. Woolmer's research program focuses on student-faculty partnerships in higher education, which is informed by critical pedagogy, sociocultural approaches to change, and the impact of pedagogical partnerships on institutional culture. So you can see she's just the perfect person to start us off. Her recent publications focus on approaches to co-creating curriculum with students, issues of equity and risk in partnerships, and working with students in the knowledge mobilization of SoTL. She's also my partner in crime, co-facilitating Mount Royal's SoTL development program, and she runs workshops and book studies on issues related to pedagogical partnerships and SoTL, offering consultations with faculty and students. And so Cherie agreed to kick things off for us, offering her perspective on how she perceives partnerships as a political act in the academy. And with that, I'll turn things over to her. Her talk is called Delivering Disruption, Positioning Student-Faculty Partnerships as a Political Act in the Academy. So please join me in welcoming Cherie.
Thanks for the lovely warm introduction, Michelle and Heather, for kind of introducing what we're starting today, which is a conversation with our colleagues who might be joining us from all sorts of different points and perspectives, different experiences, and different depths of knowledge around student partnership. I was joking with my colleagues just before starting about my past self wanting to deliver a fiery presentation that gives my perspective on the potential for student-faculty partnerships to deliver disruption in the academy. And I'm going to talk you through some of the existing scholarship that has informed some of my thinking. I want to talk to you, building off those theoretical perspectives. I want to talk to you about what partnership looks like in practice, and share with you some of my own forming thoughts about how we might get at and understand and capture disruption in the academy when it's happening as a result of partnership spaces. So I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment, but before I begin, I'd like to build on what my colleagues were just sharing about land acknowledgements, and share with you all who we have with us today. This map here shows where we have registrants for our sessions. So a range in the US and Canada, in the UK, Sweden, Japan, New Zealand, joining us today. And we're all going to be bringing, as I say, our perspectives, our understandings, our cultural perspectives that are situated in our own learning systems in our own countries. But in addition to talking about where we are from and where we're located, as has been acknowledged, we're on traditional Blackfoot territory, the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and the city of Calgary, as Heather mentioned, is home to the Métis Nation, Region 3 as well. As I'm on my own journey as a white settler scholar who arrived in Canada 6 years ago, in my own learnings around Indigenous knowledge and connecting with the Indigenous communities that I live, work and play with, I'm learning that it's really important to talk about not only where we're from, but who we are from. And this idea really resonates with me when I think about my partnership practice. Where I'm from and who I am from is such a fundamental dimension of how I want to show up in the academy, how I form my relationships, and how I think about and try and enact transformative education in the partnerships and in the teaching that I do. So to start you off, I wanted to just share a little bit about who I am and who I am from. As I said, I'm a white settler scholar who arrived in Canada 6 years ago. I arrived after doing a PhD, taking a career break in my 30s, and I arrived in Canada at McMaster to undertake my postdoc. I was born to Susan and John Woolmer. My father is still alive. My mother passed away a few years ago. But my family and their family, my ancestors are from the rural county of Lincolnshire in the East Midlands of England. It's one of the largest counties in the UK. It's very flat, it's arable. Many people work the land, and my ancestors and my parents, my grandparents, were those people who were farmers. But they were also soldiers. They fought in both world wars. My father was in active duty during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So I grew up with particular narratives also about colonialism, imperialism coming from the UK. And arriving in Canada and engaging with my commitment to truth and reconciliation, I'm also very cognizant that as a British settler in the Canadian context, coming from a home of significant empire, the amount of unlearning I have to do, not just intellectually, but also emotionally from the stories that I grew up with. Other important things that I'd like you to know about me that help me frame what I'm about to share with you today. I was a first-generation student in the 1990s going to university to study linguistics. I retain that identity and describe myself to colleagues and students as a first-generation scholar. And I position myself in that way for a very particular reason, which is that as a first generation scholar, I am in academia, but I am not from academia. This place still alienates me at times, even with all the visible and invisible privileges that I enjoy. I feel othered quite often in the academy. And so I try to share this story with colleagues and students, and come from a place of vulnerability in sharing what those experiences mean. I am also a daughter, a mother, a wife, a sister, an aunt. And I'm also an owner of fur babies. So I have dogs and cats around me as I'm presenting to you today, and I'm hoping they're going to be quite peaceful. But on a serious note, by acknowledging these range of locations that I occupy, I hope that I'm able to share with you not only the insights that I gain from the positions that I hold, but also to highlight the limitations that I know that I bring to this perspective, especially when we're talking about disruption within the academy, that by the fact that I do hold certain privileges, I'm always going to have a partial view of lived experiences of those around me. So moving into the meat of my presentation, today I want to invite you on a journey with me. And the reason why I want to frame this as a journey is I want to share with you, as I said, my evolving thinking about how different theories, perspectives, research in different sectors are helping shape my understanding of student-faculty partnerships in higher education. And I want to draw out for you, especially for those who may be less familiar with partnership literature, some of the key ideas that I think speak to this idea of the political act of partnership. So I'm going to be drawing on three particular informing perspectives for you today. And I want to be able to, in doing so, show you the kind of the historical perspectives that we see resonating in some of the more recent literature related to student-faculty partnership research, and also the kind of the breadth of different perspectives that are informing the space that we are in. It is not a complete list. I don't have time to go through all the different theories and perspectives that we see in the student partnership literature, which in itself illustrates that the body of work that exists at the present time doesn't coalesce around one particular informing theoretical framework or conceptualization of the work. And in some ways that gives a richness to the ways in which partnership experiences are researched, but it also can give a quite a complex terrain when trying to find a way into thinking about some of these ideas. So the start of the journey will be me sharing with you what I see as some important informing perspectives for us to be knowledgeable about when thinking about the potential for disruption that partnership has in the academy. I'm going to talk you through also what and where does this practice, how does it show up in the work that we're doing in the academy. So that will be drawing on some published research that talks about the ways in which students and faculty are working together to enhance teaching and learning. And I'm going to move on to share with you some of my evolving emerging thinking about how we might want to frame this idea of disruption within the academy. And I'm going to present to you what I see as an emerging ecosystem of interrelating dynamic forces that can support but also undermine the process of disruption. And I want to share with you where my thinking is about that particular model and invite you in to offer your own perspectives around that as well. And then I want to finish up presentation before we move into the discussion part to ask, well, how are we going to know when we see disruption happening. And I want to frame this with an intersectional lens, because disruption can be seen and felt and experienced very differently depending on our social locations. And I want to make a case for us taking particular approaches to evidencing value, asking about what matters rather than what works, and to suggest that taking a theory of change that is based in kind of a social cultural perspective that highlights experiences, social locations as a way of understanding change, as a useful framework for us to move forward with exploring this idea of disruption as a result of partnership. Okay, so 3 informing perspectives that I'm going to move us through here. The first that I want to share is the very rich breadth and depth of work that has happened in the K-12 sector. The language used in the research around partnership modes of working with students in the school sector is student voice. And as I say, there's a kind of breadth and depth of work that some scholars, particularly people like Alison Cooksayer, have had great success in reflecting back into post-secondary education and the work that we're doing around student partnerships. But I'd like to suggest that we could be doing more to learn from the educational research in the K-12 sector and to learn lessons from the ways in which voice has been taken up and implemented from the K-12 sector. The other informing perspective that I want to share with you is drawing on Freirean ideas related to critical pedagogy and talking about and sharing some of the research from scholars who have taken those Freirean ideas and come up with principles for informing partnership pedagogy. And then the third informing idea that I want to set the scene with today is drawing on the importance of the idea of the university and to situate the practice, the micro level practice, the relational practice of partnership in this bigger conversation around the idea of the university and the importance of understanding partnership in this institutional, political, philosophical context of the purpose and role of higher education. So I'm going to be drawing together for you just some slides, the following slides draw together for you quite disparate streams of scholarship. And I'd like you to hold all of those as I move into talking about the practice of partnership. And I'm going to explain how I see these 3 informing perspectives threading through the practice of partnership and how it helps me think about this idea of a disruptive ecosystem in the academy. So a couple of important, influential papers that I want to share here with you. Jean Ruddock and Michael Fielding, scholars in the UK, have written a lot around and have researched a lot around the ways in which student voice was quickly taken up in the UK context in schools by policy and how there was a concerted effort to bring in student voice activity and their work in the school sector was arguing there is a long history of the roots of student voice work go back to popular movements within the school system in the 70s, but even as far back as Dewey and so on, where the ideas of consultation, participation, and the democratic tradition, the idea has been around for a long time in the school sector, but hadn't really been taken up. And their work and their critique of student voice was saying, or is saying, when the idea gets taken up in policy, they describe it as the perils of popularity, that it gets taken up and reduced and abstracted from some of its core original philosophy and the aims of what was working. And so the publication in 2006 was talking about the kind of perils of popularity when policy wants to massify or scale up the student voice work, that it can come at a cost. And what they argue is it comes at a cost if when we're not asking why we are engaging in this work. So it's really Ruddock and Fielding were very strong advocates in this work being rooted in questions of why rather than how and what. And that's a theme I'm going to come back to later. Sarah Bragg, also in critiquing the way that student voice worked in the K-12 sector, was actually drawing on the idea of governmentality based in Foucault's work, where she was, in applying that theoretical framing, offering a critique and concern that student voice work in schools, in the way that it was being appropriated and being seen as apolitical in its act, was actually just reifying and producing new value hierarchies. And her paper is very articulate in raising issues of, in the producing of those new value hierarchies, certain students, certain individuals are still excluded from that process. So the kind of emancipatory democratic ideals around student voice, when they are taken up in an apolitical way, or they are appropriated by neoliberal practices, they just reify new hierarchies. And this is something that's very much a hot topic in student partnership literature also at the moment. And then our colleague Alison Cooksayer, who I mentioned earlier, who traverses the K-12 and post-secondary worlds and has done a fantastic job in bringing in her research, her connections, her understandings of student voice work in the school into our conversations about partnership, shares this reflection. And again, I think this is pertinent for us to be thinking about student partnership in higher education. She says, voice is not enough unless it's understood as the sound, presence, and power of students alongside adults. So these three forms, or these three papers that I'm sharing with you here, highlight the importance of us taking this kind of critical perspective, understanding the kind of political nature of student voice work in schools, and the dangers when we perceive of, either intentionally or unintentionally, the work as apolitical. So Jean Ruddock has this wonderful quote in her paper that I want to share with you, which I think really captures the challenge that scholars in the K-12 sector we're seeing within student voice work. She says, student voice has had greatness thrust upon it, and there is a worrying prospect that as more and more agencies become involved, which is of course a good thing in itself, as more and more pupil voice websites are set up, and as more and more how to do it resources are produced, we may have mile-wide promotion with only inch-thick understanding. Schools need to take time to think why they want to develop student consultation and what the risks and benefits will be for them. And the for them is an interesting point to depart, in that for them being the teachers, the school leadership, but also for the students. When we create these spaces, what are the risks and benefits that we're opening ourselves up to? So thinking about the dangers of mile-wide promotion with only inch-thick understanding. I want to now move us into the ways in which we currently define student-faculty partnerships in higher education. There's an oft-cited book by Alison Cooksayer, Kathy Bovill, and Peter Felton, published in 2014, where they offer their emerging perspectives on how to define student-faculty partnerships. So partnership work is inherently value-based. It takes a position that is about how we want to relate to one another, personally, intellectually, and so on. And in their book, they talk about partnerships. Students and faculty make distinct contributions. And elsewhere, they talk about it not necessarily being the same kinds of contribution, recognizing that we have different knowledges and experiences and expertise that we're bringing. Faculty make distinct contributions that are equally valued in pursuit of common goals. What each brings to the partnership, the experience, expertise, and perspectives is valued, is respected and valued and drawn upon. So they talk about respect, reciprocity, and shared responsibility as being key values that inform partnership work. But what I want to draw your attention here to at the end of this quote is that perspectives are drawn upon. So in partnership spaces, unlike our feedback models where we ask for students in a very transactional way, we set the questions, we ask for feedback, we take the feedback as faculty and staff and decide on the actions that happen. We are in dialogue in partnership spaces. So perspectives are brought together, they are equally encountered and considered, and then there is an explicit, transparent conversation about how those perspectives are drawn upon to inform action. It doesn't mean to say that all perspectives are acted upon, but all perspectives must be genuinely and authentically considered. So bridging this idea of student voice work in the K-12 sector and this growing interest in the idea of students as partners, the term really came about in around 2012 to 2014. We were seeing more and more mention of students as partners. An important piece was written by Cathy Bovill that I'd like to share here. And again, it resonates with the Ruddock and Fielding quote on the student voice work in schools. She reminded us that whilst colleagues like Ryan and Tilbury were talking about how learner empowerment in 2013 and processes of co-creation were considered one of the most radical movements happening in higher education at that time, Cathy Bovill reminded us that actually these ideas have been around for a long time. And she agrees it is a radical idea, but perhaps we just didn't get around to implementing them the first time. So I share this quote here with you. She says, "The current higher education literature calling for students to be more active participants in their learning does not always draw upon the long tradition of critical pedagogy or popular education and the more radical, emancipatory, or transformatory rationales that underpin calls for negotiated curricula in much of the historical literature." So Bovill's work here was really a call for us to make sure that when we're thinking about moving forward with some of these what might feel like radical practices, a reminder that there's a history, there's a substance to the work that we're doing that ensures it stays connected to its political roots. So what might these be? And again, this takes me into the second domain of the informing perspectives that I shared with you on that earlier slide. Again, I'm not going to attempt to give an overview of the entire literature related to critical pedagogy and critical theory, but I do want to draw to your attention the work of Paulo Freire. Freire's ideas, published in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, being one of his most popular publications, is perhaps one of the more compelling ideas that we do see in relation to critical pedagogy and his work showing up in existing student partnership research. For those of you not familiar with Freire's work, one of the key concepts that he writes about in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed is this challenge to what he describes as the banking model of education. And I've written here, using some of his words, that education in the banking model becomes an active narration and a depositing of knowledge deemed to be important by the teacher. And students are seen as empty vessels that the teacher has to fill with the content of the teacher's narration. So it's very transactional, it's very unidirectional in the idea that Paulo Freire talks about the banking model of education. But perhaps most importantly in his work, he sees this banking model as being a form of oppression. And he talks about how the ability for a teacher to deposit knowledge into the empty vessel of the student ultimately serves the end of the oppressor. For the more the oppressed can be led to adapt, the more easily they can be dominated. Now, some of this language can feel quite challenging for some when thinking about how we might relate to students as partners, how we might conceive of and do education differently. And Freire was writing in a particular political context, at a point in time. And I've certainly had, when discussing these ideas with colleagues, some resistance to, does that really apply in the context of higher education? And I'd like to suggest that it does. And in doing so, I'd like to share with you the work from Peters and Mathias. This work is published in the International Journal for Students as Partners. And what they did was they took the work of Freire and particularly his idea of the banking model of education, and very eloquently talked about how there is space for us to take Freirean ideas to develop a pedagogy of partnership. The article's really worth a read if you're interested in exploring this idea in more detail. But what I just want to share with you here are 6 principles that they talk about in that article for informing how we might think about a pedagogy of partnership. So they talk about building from a shared hope and believing in our transformative potential. They suggest we should ask collectively how we can be more and establishing a shared dream of transformation. Talk about promoting respectful dialogue, engaging in co-investigation, shared reflection, problem posing, curiosity, rational exploration, and creativity, seeking the co-construction of solutions aimed at a better way of being together, and on an ongoing transformative and collaborative process of being and becoming, and framing this around hope and being different and existing differently in the academy. I love the language that they're talking about here. I feel it is aspirational, it is hopeful, it speaks to the agency that we can each take in the academy in making change to education. So how might thinking about some of the ideas and the lessons learned in K-12 sector, thinking about some of these ideas, these Freirean ideas of resisting transactional ideas of faculty and student interactions, resisting the ideas of this banking model of education, and thinking about pedagogy that is around hope and transformation and co-construction of solutions to problems in education. How does that fit into conversations about the purpose of higher education? Again, there's a vast literature that talks about the idea of the university, and a number of higher education researchers have written prolifically on this topic. Barnett, who is mentioned in this quote, here. I don't have time to go into great detail, but what I do want to draw your attention to is again, a fantastic article by Typus Sater and Amani Bell, our colleagues in Australia, who have taken some of that literature and research and the philosophical conversation that is happening around the idea of the university. And they've used that to position, critique, and make suggestions about the purpose of partnership in higher education. And they advocate for those of us that are involved in the practice of partnership to help our students see what they describe as seeing institutionally. And they talk about partnership work needing to be built on a foundation of students understanding the nature of the academy, the politics of how institutions work. And again, I share a quote here for you that I think captures the hope as well as the message of that they're advocating for about teaching students to see institutionally. They say, "We are keen for our students to be curious about why practices in universities, teaching, curriculum, timetabling, research, student representation, governance, etc., look the way they do. In part, this is about our student partners grasping the complexity of the university as an institution in evolution and an idea that remains unfinished." Barnett, 2016, and to see its unfinishedness as an opening for their participation. So what might that look like in practice? To share an example of my own teaching this year, being able to work with first-year students to design an undergraduate research project where they are investigating the ideas of belonging and mattering on the university campus. To do that kind of work with them, I am having to introduce them to these bigger ideas about the idea of university, how their personal experiences or the approaches that faculty take in creating belonging in their classroom, how it fits within institutional structures, processes, values, and so on. In the scholarship of teaching and learning, I think introducing students to see institutionally can be at points where we might talk about the being and becoming a SoTL scholar. Why do we do things the way that we do? Why do we have conversations about authorship, order in the work that we do? It could also be highlighting some of the tensions and complexities that we see, for example, in student evaluations of teaching, and how introducing them to the research that shows that as tools of evaluating teaching, they are inherently biased and discriminatory and so on, and inviting students into these conversations about how things work the way they do and jointly questioning why things work the way they do. Thinking then about the ideas from Peters and Mathias about how do we co-create solutions is really how I see the idea of the university and this concept of seeing institutionally dovetailing so nicely with the micro level practice of being in conversation and partnerships. So just to recap, I've given you those three informing perspectives that sit in parallel to one another. They don't necessarily fit like a jigsaw puzzle, but I hope they give you some sense of how there are kind of like spokes of a wheel that I see converging into helping us think about the practice of partnership. Really interested in the discussion phase to hear from you about other informing perspectives and theories that you might be drawing upon in your own work. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I'm using the metaphor of bicycles a little bit too much, I think. To raise this question, thinking about these ideas, thinking about this rich literature that offers us perspectives on how we might conceive of and situate partnership work as political work in the academy. I want to shift now to share with you some of the things that is reported in the literature, but also what I see and hear anecdotally in conversations with faculty and students, either in my own partnership work or in the partnership work that I support others to engage in. And I want to just kind of position what I see and hear in practice talk with some of these theoretical, aspirational ideas that I've just shared from the literature. So some of the reasons faculty report why they want to work with students as partners in enhancing teaching and learning. They're really interested in working with the lived experiences of being a student as one of the primary reasons, where faculty who recognize they are somewhat removed, some time removed from their experience of being a student. But they may also have a very kind of functional reason of wanting to work with a student who could have different skills or different theoretical knowledges to their own. This comes up quite a lot in scholarship of teaching and learning, where we might have, for example, a colleague in chemistry doing SoTL research with human participants, and they're really keen to work with a student who's got a qualitative methods background. But I think one of the reasons that I hear that's quite compelling that faculty want to work with students, and they don't always necessarily go in with this motivation, but they see it when they're in partnership spaces, which I think speaks back to some of the literature, is faculty are really keen to have different kinds of conversations with students. They're aware of the limitations of transactional feedback models, and they're aware that they get to dig deeper, they get to delve deeper into and get better insights and information and better dialogue when we are in partnership spaces outside of the traditional classroom space. And they can create opportunities for this idea of co-creating solutions. It also gives opportunity to co-create a shared understanding of what the problems are as well. So those are compelling reasons why faculty who often engage in partnership are willing to give their time to invest in this kind of work, but also to think about coming back into this space and as a transformative way of working with students. Why do students want to work with faculty? So the opportunity for sharing ownership and sharing responsibility, for being heard, is a compelling reason for students. Our students are also very aware of the limitations of the feedback models that we often use around teaching effectiveness, course development, and so on. But other things that, again, I think speak back to some of these ideas that we were hearing about from the literature, students are often transformed when they get to see behind the curtain of teaching, when they realize the connection between what they see from their individual faculty member in the classroom is not just down to individual choices by that faculty member. There is a system at play, there is power at play for that individual faculty member as well. That influences how they show up in the classroom, how they show up around program review, how they show up around the research that they might want to engage in on their teaching. But there are also some very transactional benefits that students are looking to gain from partnership spaces. Whether we like it or not, they are operating in a neoliberal context. And so thinking about skills to be gained that could support students in grad school or thinking about future work is understandably part of the agenda of why students want to engage in this kind of opportunity. So thinking about opportunities to present or publish work, developing skills in particular research areas and so on are what students are also looking for. So I use this term sites of practice, and I don't want to dwell too much actually today in the what is happening and where it's happening, because I'm wanting to talk about why we are engaging in partnership, why it's important to frame it as a political act. But just to share with you, and there is a wealth of literature on what partnership looks like in action. But students and faculty are working in partnership to enhance teaching and learning through activities like curriculum enhancement, teaching consultancy, where students are observing and giving feedback to faculty on their teaching, specifically in scholarship of teaching and learning, where faculty are researching with students rather than on students, students engaging in quality assurance work, journal editing work. For example, the International Journal of Students as Partners has a joint faculty student editorial board where students are fully partners in the decisions made about the scholarship that is published within that journal. But what I want to raise here that kind of leads me into thinking about this disruptive ecosystem is we need to be conscious that partnership isn't just happening in these sites of practice. Partnership is happening in what I perhaps unhelpfully describe as the spaces in between. Our understanding of the political nature of partnership is happening in backstage conversations that faculty and students are having, the spaces in between asking, you know, oh, this happened, why was that the case, and so on. So we talk about the difference between capturing and emphasizing the importance of process of partnership as well as the product of partnership. And I'd like to just unpack this idea of the process of partnership and say that it's those informal, in-between backstage conversations where places of understanding and dismantling can happen around hierarchy and so on. And I'd love for us to be able to come back to that. And I'd like to invite you to think about what, if you're engaged in partnership work, what are those in-between spaces? What are the topics of conversations that you're having? And in what way are they disruptive? In what way are they dismantling some of those hegemonic practices that we all encounter in the academy? So just moving into the final part of my presentation, I shared with you that I've been thinking about the ways in which I am coming to understand the opportunities, but also the limitations for disruption in the academy. And I'm trying to think about what are the constituent parts that contribute to an ecosystem that could eventually think about disrupting the academy, challenging hierarchies, making universities more socially just places. It's a tall order that we're trying to address through our partnership work. So here I present a model with 3 constituent parts at the moment. And I think these 3 constituent parts have a place to agitate and create disruption, but they can also, in a very dynamic, interrelational way, undermine and prevent us from achieving the disruption that we want to see through this partnership as a political act approach. So the first component, I think, is knowledge of self. Being able to engage reflexively with, as a faculty member, I will speak from my own perspective here, about why I'm engaging in this work, what I find challenging, where I'm successful, where I am not successful, how does this relate to my own agendas, and what space do I have to meet the agendas of other people, and where can we collectivize within that. That work, I've been involved in partnership work for almost a decade now. That work is never done. Every partnership experience gives me a new insight. So there's a requirement, there's a precursor, I think, when I think about the ideas of readiness to engage in partnership, is a willingness to engage in reflexivity. We talk about this a lot in our research work. But how do we introduce that reflexivity when we're thinking about our teaching philosophy and how we want to engage and be in the academy? And how do we do that in a safe way also? I know I mentioned before about I recognize the privileges that I enjoy that make it easier for me to be perhaps more transparent and open than some of my other colleagues, which I want to come back to in a moment. Then the other dimension of this disruptive ecosystem idea I'm playing around with is the relationship with others. So I can do the internal work of knowledge of self, my motivations, my philosophies that I'm bringing into a partnership space. But I have to be also very aware that I am in relationship constantly with others. I'm in relationship with my student partners. I'm in relationship with my more senior colleagues in partnership spaces. I am role modeling and in relationship to my more junior colleagues that I might be mentoring in partnership spaces. And that, so there is inherently an interpretation and a reinterpretation as we think about partnership in this relational way. And then the third part of this disruptive ecosystem that kind of ties in the idea of micro level relationships. And what I want to do is get away from simply talking about micro and macro systems, is that as self and in relationship with others, we are in constant interaction with systems. And those systems are policy frameworks. They are evaluation systems, those that are codified in the work that we do. But they are also value-based systems. They are cultural systems within the academy and so on. And there is opportunity and harm that can happen as we navigate and interact between self, others, and these systems. So in the center, the other aspect of my thinking so far in this disruptive ecosystem, and I'm really keen to hear the extent to which this may resonate or it may connect with other informing theories that you might be using in your own work, is in the midst of this dynamic ecosystem of disruption, there are explicit and hidden aspects of the work that we encounter through partnership. Power has been written about extensively and is perhaps the most pervasive issue when we're thinking about disruption, because disruption, the aim of disruption is ultimately about challenging positions of power. But there is also elements of risk, potential harm, of moving in and out of hospitable and inhospitable places, where partnership may or may not be welcomed. But there's also feelings of joy and elation to be found in places where knowledge of self and interaction with others happen. And we're fundamentally investing in what Paceto and Bell talked about, the unfinished idea of the university. So we are inherently contributing to continuous processes of change. And within that, we will meet setbacks and challenges as well. So I think that there is what I'm particularly keen on in exploring this idea of a disruptive ecosystem in the academy is rooting this ecosystem in the political work of partnership, of it being a cyclical process rather than a linear process where gains are made, but also challenges are experienced and setbacks are experienced. And underpinning all of this, I think, is the importance of us thinking about taking an intersectional lens when we're trying to understand what disruption might mean. And I just want to draw your attention here for those that might not be familiar with some of the fantastic scholars that are working on this. Beth Marquis at McMaster, had the privilege of working with Beth where we were researching the impact of faculty social location and the experience of partnership, which showed unintentionally, we can think of faculty and students as a dichotomy, but actually within faculty and within student communities, we're heterogeneous and we occupy different social locations. And so partnership activity for faculty who are socially located in one way may be more or less risky than it might be for their colleagues. So thinking about heterogeneity in this work is really important. I'd also like to draw your attention to the work of Maisha Islam, who's going to be one of our future speakers in this series, who has been doing fantastic work on understanding the experiences of hyper-minoritized students, particularly Muslim students in the UK context. Yolno, who is an Indigenous student writing about their experiences of being involved in partnership work and their experience of being their Indigenous way of knowing and being excluded and dismissed in partnership spaces, and the work of Elise Deby, who has co-authored a fantastic book with colleagues looking at how to promote equity and social justice through partnership. And Elise takes a framing of epistemic violence in the academy and the ways in which partnership can help us overcome the harms experienced around epistemic violence in the academy, and how to think about, in a thoughtful way, how we might bring that practice to a wider audience in the academy. So just to finish up here, conscious of time, you talked about delivering disruption, and in preparing this presentation, I was thinking, well, how will we know it when we see it? What's it going to look like? Acknowledging that disruption for me may look different to you, to the next person. Acknowledging that it's dynamic, that it's relational. Partnership work is messy work. It's emotional work. It is liberatory, but because it's relational work, it is exhausting work. It sometimes feels really hard to know how to scale this work. It can feel like, the disruption happens in tiny pockets and spaces. But is that okay? Is that what leads to a greater sense of change over a period of time? How do we sustain one another when we're working in this way that is countercultural in a neoliberal academy, where it can be not just misunderstood, but sometimes actively undermined and shut down? How do we collectivize to ensure that the journeying of disrupting and our hope to create more socially just academies can actually happen? And I'd like to just finish up with saying, I think we'll know it when we see it, depending on how we want to evidence it. And this is where I'll finish up with saying, advocating for sociocultural approaches to understanding change. I think it's important when we're thinking about how we want to capture what it looks like, is that we're drawing on work by colleagues like Ronnie Bamber, who is suggesting that we should be thinking about evidencing value rather than impact, capturing what matters rather than what works. In a kind of technocratic world that we all exist in our academies, capturing what works rather than what matters is often the dominant discourse that we're trying to rally against. A process of change that emphasizes the relational nature of partnership practice, recognizing that relationships are experienced differently. Some people are at the table and many aren't, and that's that inequity to participate is something that we need to be really cognizant of moving forward as we take this work to other places in the academy. I'm really interested in how, and again, perhaps thinking of this metaphor of an ecosystem, how we can think about capturing networks and ecosystems in the models of change that we're looking for. And this relates to my final point on this slide, which is we are journeying. There are theories of change that consider shooting the arrow and hitting the mark. But in the complexity that we are dealing with, social cultural approaches of change are interested in the personal, cultural, and political contexts that interact and shift over time. What Murray Saunders talks about, the indicators of effective change look like as we're journeying, knowing that our work is likely never to be done, that the idea of the university is unfinished, and that we are part of that collective movement in trying to achieve the change that we want to see. So I think in concluding what I've shared with you today, I just want to say that I think we can deliver disruption by resisting appropriation of neoliberal ideas, discourses, and so on. And we resist by informing ourselves and holding on to the kind of the political and theoretical substance to the work that we're trying to do. And I think we can deliver disruption by being cognizant of developing the ecosystems that can help us advance the ideas, can help us collectivize, and can help sustain us in the messy and hard work that we're engaging with in the partnership work that we're looking to develop and sustain, I should say. So those are the ideas from me, and I'm really looking forward to your questions, your challenges, your comments, your thoughts. But before doing so, I just want to say, where next? After, really, I wanted this talk to be a scene setting, to inform you around some of my own ideas, but to also introduce you to some of the ideas that our speakers in March and April will be returning to and diving into in much more detail. Dates are yet to be set, but you will be receiving further information soon. In March, we have Maisha Islam from the UK, David Hornsby at Carleton in Canada, speaking about, from their different perspectives, ideas of resonance and dissonance in partnership work. David will be drawing on his experience of being in South Africa during the fall of the apartheid and how that's informed his thinking about partnership, and Maisha will be sharing some of her work around working with hyper-minoritized students in a UK context in partnership spaces. And in April, we have Julie Rattray and Sophia Abbott. Julie is a scholar, leading scholar in the threshold concepts arena, and has been doing some really interesting writing and thinking around epistemicide and the challenges of when we reify one person as being the expert knowledge keeper. And she's going to be talking with us about how partnership ideas sit alongside some of those challenges that she's thinking about in threshold concepts. And Sophia Abbott is going to be talking about her journeying through being a student partner to a staff member to a graduate student partner, drawing on some of the theories and in particular feminist theory, how that's helped her ground and understand her partnership experience. I'm a little over time, I apologize, but I'm going to pause there, and I think we're going to be able to move into questions.
Thank you so much, Cherie, for that talk. I'm really appreciating how theoretically nuanced you've been this morning, and but also practice-based and bringing those two things together in such a wonderful way. So thank you. I have lots of questions, but I want to we want to turn it over. Heather and I would like to turn it over to our participants first to see what questions you may have or discussion. I see a little bit of a discussion developing in the chat as well. So feel free to either raise your hand and you can unmute yourself and ask a question, or to type it into the chat. Either way will work. But there was a first question from Heather Lewis in the chat that I wanted to acknowledge. So, and Heather, I don't know if these are two separate questions or one question, but what are the perils? Heather asked, what are the perils within SoTL itself? And can you talk about the work on upgrading and how that promotes partnerships?
The perils in SoTL itself that I see working in partnership space, I think there's work to do for faculty members. I think there's a long tradition in scholarship of teaching and learning of hiring students as research assistants. And I think the perils within scholarship of teaching and learning, or perhaps not perils, but the kind of sensitization that I think faculty need to be aware of in working with students as partners in SoTL is doing some of that self-reflexive work of, why do I want to bring a student into this space? Because often the faculty are gatekeepers, and in what ways can they contribute to the design, the data collection, the data analysis, the publication process? So in what ways do you perceive the student contributing at all stages of a SoTL project? And quite often I find when I'm doing consultancy work with faculty who are maybe new to scholarship of teaching and learning, or definitely new to working with student partners, is they have a very narrow conception of what a student can do. But if we're really into the business of wanting to work in partnership, where students and faculty get to work on deciding what are the important questions to ask, then it's beholden to us to be working with students right from the get-go, and not assuming that we have a privileged position on saying these are the research questions that we want to have. So quite, I think one of the perils is thinking too narrowly in SoTL about what we can work with students on. I think another, and this is a very practical, and I don't know if I have any of my student partners in the talk today, they might jump in if they're here. One of the very practical barriers, I think, that we also need to be really aware of, being transparent with students about, is the messiness of the research process, and just how long it takes to get work to the publication stage. And I think there are particular barriers within scholarship of teaching and learning when faculty might be doing it on the side of their desk. It's not their core research program. Things inevitably take longer. Students engaging in SoTL projects haven't seen behind that curtain. They haven't often had the chance to see the reality of doing, being and becoming a researcher. Being really cognizant about how power shows up in research teams. I talked about the importance of backstage conversations in partnership work. I've recently had a SoTL experience where those backstage conversations were essential for me to be able to support a student partner in a research partnership with several people, where there were power dynamics happening in very curious ways across the research team. But I know I do have some student SoTL scholars on the call, and I kind of don't want to monopolize either. And I want to invite others to jump in with what are the perils of working in partnership in SoTL, if anyone wants to. No? And there was a second part to the question that I have forgotten. I apologize.
The second part was about, can you talk about the work on upgrading and how it promotes partnerships?
Heather, can you say a bit more about upgrading? Sorry, I'm not familiar with what the particular context that you're talking about there.
Actually, I'm not sure that Heather, are you still on the call? I'm not sure that she is actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she may.
Oh, ungrading. Thanks, Sophia. The context was probably ungrading rather than upgrading. Yeah, ungrading is a really interesting space to be thinking about how we have different conversations with students. And I think there's great potential if we're able to take the time to fully explain and have students on board with the idea of ungrading. And this is where that disruptive ecosystem for me comes into play. We can have a micro level conversation, but as Kevin Gannon writes about, we're operating in structures that undermine some of these attempts that we're trying to bring into our classroom teaching around ungrading, where students are conditioned to see grades as the most important aspect of their learning. I haven't personal experience of ungrading in any of my classroom contexts and how that is seen. I have the counter opposite of where I've tried to co-create curriculum with students, actually saying, well, is this going to count? Am I going to get graded for it? Why should I put the time into this? Don't go messing up things. I know kind of what I'm doing. I don't like the risk involved. So I think there's the consequence for partnership is, how do we step into a place to take a risk and bring our students with us? And I think that's quite difficult to do in some, when it's just us with a classroom context. So thinking about perhaps models where you might work with a smaller group of students and they work with you to be explaining to students why particular processes might be happening in the classroom, a choice, a decision to go with ungrading and so on, and about how it benefits the different people involved differently, could be really interesting.
I saw there was a hand raised earlier. Fabiola, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Sorry about that. Yeah, I was just trying to formulate it in my head. So thank you very much for your presentation. I also was really drawn to the various different kind of theoretical perspectives. I'm kind of thinking more on the practical side, and something that I've been, I guess, kind of pondering how to bring in partnership into curriculum, because I'm finding that when I call for student partners in SoTL projects, you get kind of the usual suspects, and they tend to be students of privilege. And that's not to say that all students don't, aren't equally valued, but I want to be able to draw in students who come from various backgrounds and bring in very, very different lived experiences and frames. And so, trying to think about how to make that a piece of the curriculum rather than something that's extracurricular that adds an additional time burden and workload to students. I think it's something I've been struggling on ways of doing that, and I've managed some of it through independent courses, so like independent reading courses, so that there's credit for it too. But I'm wondering about your thoughts on that and how to ease the extra burden. And particularly, I work with undergraduates, so it's a little bit, even more burdensome when they have a full course load and work and perhaps family responsibilities that some students don't have.
Yeah, great question. And at Mount Royal, my teaching context is undergraduate only as well. I think so. There's work that I've done with Kathy Bovill where we've tried to tease out a little more when we're talking about partnership in curriculum spaces. Is it partnership in co-creation of the curriculum? So where those spaces might happen in advance of, kind of evaluating, redesigning a course, that kind of model of co-creation with students is often with a select group of people. And the course is not yet running. So a distinction between co-creation of the curriculum and co-creation in the curriculum, like as it's live happening in the class. And I'm teaching this semester trying exactly this, where the course that I was mentioning around students researching the idea of belonging and mattering on campus and framing that as an undergraduate research project where they're drawing on their own experiences of belonging and mattering. They're interviewing faculty about how faculty go about creating belonging in their classroom. And we're just about to move into interim analysis of that data in the class to co-create our reading list. So what I'm trying to do, and maybe come and speak to me again in a month to see how this goes, but this bears out in the research literature as well about co-creating curriculum in the classroom, is I want to work with my students who are all differently socially located to kind of collectively look at the ways in which, what are they seeing in their data that is of interest to them to dive into. I will scaffold that process because we have a focus on equity and inclusion as the primary issue that we're investigating in that class. But I need a plan B, because if it falls, these are first year students, I'm asking a lot of them. If it falls flat on its face, I need to have a reading list ready to go. So what I will say is I've tried to combine in that space, and again, others will have interesting examples as well, of creating an environment where minoritized students feel safe to contribute. And thinking about a myriad of ways that they can contribute their ideas. And it's been really interesting seeing students who are incredibly quiet, have written kind of reflective essays about not feeling like they belong at all at the university, how to create belonging in my own teaching so that they feel they can participate has been really important. So individual writing as well as group work, individual writing that's not graded, that's written only to me, me being able to model writing back to my students about what I want them to know about me and what belonging means to me, has meant to me in my time at university, those kinds of things. Sorry, I'm rambling a little bit here, Fabiola, but just to say, I think investing the time to have a plan B, starting small and experimenting if you want to do partnership and co-creation in the curriculum. So it might just be around one learning activity, and being really transparent with the students about what you're trying to do. Because I think if it doesn't go right and that's that student's only experience of partnership, it could be really, it could turn them off to being open to other ways of working as well. But thinking about whole class approaches and whole class participation, if you're interested in that, Kathy Bovill's leading the way on writing about the imperative to think about whole class participation because of issues of equity and inclusion.
Okay, thanks very much. I appreciate that.
I can ask a question, Cherie. I was thinking about, as you're speaking, you spoke about a lot of concepts around disruption and transformation, and I really appreciated the kind of move into a discussion about hope as well, and challenge and risk. I'm wondering about, I guess for individuals, about the role of discomfort in the process. So I think you're talking about partnership as a political act and disruption to hopefully to the institution. But these approaches are disruptive to individuals as well, as when we think about identity formation. So whether that's on for faculty or for students, and what they've come to know as kind of a successful strategy of how to be in the world, how to be in their professional lives, how to be in the classroom. So I just wondered if you could speak a bit more about maybe your own experience, or I think theoretically we could accept that disruption or discomfort would be a natural part of the process, but then how do we actually work through that so that it becomes an opening to transformation rather than people closing down and kind of disappearing from the process?
Yeah, fantastic question. And actually, this is a topic that our April speaker, Sophia Abbott, who on my screen is right next to you, actually, Michelle, will be talking about from her own experience. So I'll take two perspectives on discomfort. Some of my own discomfort in partnership spaces, and what I hear in mentoring other faculty who are new to partnership space. So I think for me in partnership spaces, the discomfort, a big discomfort for me is, I've grown into feeling comfortable with what I used to feel really uncomfortable about. So being able to share openly, I'm a first generation scholar and the academy others me in ways, even though I've worked in it for 25 years, that moving from discomfort to being comfortable about taking that risk. And it is an act of risk for me to show up in that way. Is one area of discomfort. I didn't feel I was showing up as my full self, and I felt inauthentic by presenting in a certain way to my student partners and to my faculty colleagues as well. So there's something about the discomfort of making a decision about what to share, what not to overshare, what are the important parts of your identity. And I share different things with different students, and I share different things with different faculty partners, because this is the other thing. It's not just me often in partnership with a student or a couple of students. There are also power dynamics between me working in partnership with more senior colleagues, for example. And so there can be discomfort navigating some of those things. I think I've also personally and continue to feel discomfort with the emotional and intellectual labor of progressing at a pace that I know the student wants to move at. And having to step into some uncomfortable places when I'm not able to, for a variety of reasons, progress something. I'm very conscious that I have an ongoing space in the academy where students are, that they're inherently time bound. And so there are places and spaces where I felt like I have failed. I have failed in the relationship to move things as fast as I can. At the pace that the student wants. And then other places of discomfort that I hear are speakers that are following in March and April are going to speak about some very particular experiences that relate to discrimination, microaggression, and so on. So I don't want to go into that, but I do hear a common area of discomfort for faculty new to partnership is how to exercise their own agency when they're negotiating ideas. So a very concrete example would be in a curriculum review process, faculty is desperately wanting to work in this partnership mode. Students make a suggestion, they're all really on board, and the faculty member is feeling like, I'm doing all this self-reflective work and I'm not 100% on board, I'm not sure it's going to work. And then they feel like they've lost their voice in the process. I'm probably not articulating that accurately, but what does it mean to be in a space and being very aware of the process of checking your positions of power, being open to other ideas, you also taking risks, is something that I hear is a place of discomfort for faculty as well.
All right, well, seeing none at the moment, please join me, all of you, in thanking Cherie for a really thought-provoking talk. And I think based on some of the comments we've seen here, a lot of us are going away with some things to think about and ideas about how to apply this in our own context. So really appreciate that. We hope to see you all again at the next part of this series, and everyone who registered for this talk will get some information on that when the time comes. So please keep an eye on your inboxes for that. And thanks everybody again. Have a great rest of your day.